Sarah had listened to the recording with Sybil so many times she had lost count. Finally, she had just sat there. In the stark white living room, Gina's latest minimalist obsession had been a sharp departure from her Liberace days. She stared out at the sky, filled with orange and red hues from the setting sun. Gina bustled in, shopping bags in one hand and what smelled like Thai takeout in the other. "Girl, you would not believe what I found. The most delicious flats you have ever seen in a cherry red," Gina crowed. "They have them in your size, honey, and I insist we go back there tomorrow. Gina took in Sarah sitting in the dark and stopped and set the bags down on the counter. "Sarah, honey, what's wrong?" Sarah managed to smile. "It's nothing, Gina, really." Gina, far more empathic than anyone past Sarah or the long-departed Scotty knew, shook her head. "Right, and I'm Genghis Khan." She dumped her bags in the corner of the living room and set the Thai takeout on the counter. "I'll fix you cannoli tomorrow night." She pulled 2 plates out of the cabinet, opened the myriad of boxes, and beckoned Sarah over. "Food, even takeout, makes everything better." The edges of Sarah's mouth twitched. There was no such thing as secrets when it came to Gina. And despite the older woman's flamboyant ways and addiction to shopping, Sarah had found her friend to be intensely loyal and rather grounded. She reached for the plate and began poking through the boxes. "Try the pad cow pow moo. It's delish." Gina flapped a hand in another box. "And you haven't lived until you've tried the yum nua. It'll light you up, but it's worth it." She leaned over her plate and sucked in a large mouthful of noodles, her eyes closing in pleasure as she chewed. Sarah dug into the food heaped on the plate. She hadn't eaten breakfast or lunch, and after leaving the hospital and seeing Sybil's body contorting, her eyes as black as coal, any appetite Sarah might have had for lunch had deserted her. She had driven back to Gina's beach house on autopilot, her mind turning and turning again on the interview with Sybil Zradchi. There was silence for a few minutes as both of them attacked the takeout with zeal. Sarah sighed as she ate a mouthful of yum nua. Gina was right. It was better than any Thai food she had ever tasted before. As soon as the last bite of food had disappeared from her plate, Gina stood up. "I'm making us decaf, and you are going to tell me what happened today." There was no question in her words, more a statement of fact. Gina was used to getting her way, after all, and after she set the steaming cup of decaf down in front of Sarah, she plopped down in the chair opposite and barked, "Spill it, sister." Sarah pressed play on her cell phone, and Gina listened in silence until it was done. "Where's the rest of it?" When I returned from the bathroom, she was in a grand mal seizure, the likes of which I had never seen before, Sarah answered quietly. "Her doctor said I could return tomorrow." Gina stared at the phone, then back up to Sarah. "Honey, she's crazy. All that talk of another world and some guy and a train bombing, you realize she's completely off her rocker, right?" There was just something about her, Gina. I can't explain it. The way she looked at me, the things she said, and she knew things she couldn't have known. "Sarah, honey, a broken clock is right twice a day. I figure it can't be far off from that." She took Sarah's hand. "Listen, you need to relax and stop thinking about this for tonight. Go back tomorrow if you must. But meanwhile, sit down and watch Dancing with the Stars with me, will ya? What's his name is so hot. I hear their ratings have skyrocketed since Mr. Hot Pants has been shaking his patoot off for all to see. Sit down for a few minutes, take your mind off the crazy people for a while, and I guarantee you will fall in lust with him right along with me." Sarah giggled. Gina was an unstoppable force, and she let the older woman pull her over to the plush white sofa and click on the large flat-screen television on the far wall. "We missed the first few minutes, but that's okay. Mr. Hot Pants isn't on until later. He and his partner are performing nearly halfway through the hour." As the screen jumped to life, Gina frowned and stared at the display. "What is this?" Sarah stared, too horrified to answer, as the television showed blood and gurneys and fire trucks instead of scantily clad women and their dance partners. The headline across the bottom of the screen said it all. Terrorists strike at the heart of the Atlantic Railway during morning commute. "Oh my God," Gina whispered. "I've traveled through that station more times than I can count." Her normally ebullient self was muted in shock as she read the words trailing across the screen. "Multiple incendiary devices, fire and—" Her voice petered out. "Over 5,000 people reported dead or missing," Sarah breathed beside her. "Sybil saw this in a vision." The two women stared in shocked silence, occasional gasps from each of them as they watched the images rolling across the screen. The commentators themselves looked haggard and raw. "How did we miss this?" Sarah asked. "I had Sirius on all day," Gina replied, her perfectly applied makeup streaked with tears. "Oh, God, Sarah, all those people!" It brought back the memories of 9/11. It brought back the memories of 9/11 hard and fast, and both continued to watch the screen, Gina's hand creeping over to hold onto Sarah's, seeking the reassurance of another. Gina reached for her phone a dozen times, only to set it down again. "I don't think I'm ready to know," she said quietly when Sarah asked. I just can't, you know?" Most of Gina's life had been spent on the East Coast, around the very area affected. The dark closed in outside, and the two women watched the television without speaking until nearly midnight. Sarah stood up finally and pressed the off button and turned to Gina. "Enough. We can't do anything tonight, but if you need to go home tomorrow, I can help you find a flight." "No." Gina's reply was quiet, almost inaudible. "I'd only be a burden. Look at me. I'm good for shopping and makeup tips, Sarah." She flapped her fingers, her rings flashing in the dim light of the room, mascara streaking her cheeks. "I have no place there." Sarah had never heard her friend sound so alone, so bereft. She sat back down on the couch and took Gina's hands. "That's not true, Gina. You make the best damn cannoli I've ever tasted. Go home, volunteer to help with meals for the rescue crews, but wear flats for crying out loud. Those Jimmy Choos will kill your arches." Gina snorted, stifling laughter, and then met Sarah's gaze. "Do you really think I could make a difference?" "Gina, love, go home. Go cook up a storm. I know it will help." "Did you get a lick of sleep?" Sarah asked blearily, a handful of hours later, as Gina bustled about the small house, packing, it appeared, for a small army to descend on New York. There were 3 large suitcases, in addition to her carry-on and voluminous purse. Sarah sat on the edge of the sofa and tried to order her thoughts, but the lack of sleep, combined with the horror of the previous evening's news, had left her foggy-brained and slow. "I'll sleep on the plane. Believe it or not, I get the best sleep on planes." Gina's face was excited as well as determined. It had taken a little more convincing last night from Sarah, but by the time Sarah headed for bed, Gina had been online searching for flights. Her steps were fast, purposeful, as she strode from one end of the house to the next. "The cab should be here in 5 minutes, and my flight isn't for 3 hours. That's more than enough time to get to LAX, go through security, and have a coffee before takeoff." Sarah nodded, and the motion made her head and stomach spin. Perhaps it was more than just lack of sleep. Was she coming down with something? She swallowed, noting a painful patch in her throat. Now is not the time to be sick. Gina's voice intruded. "Sarah, honey, are you okay? You don't look as perky as you normally do." Sarah glanced up at her friend, whose expression had turned from barely contained excitement and nervousness to concern. "I'm fine, Gina. Probably just the beginnings of some stupid head cold. Absolutely nothing to worry about." Gina walked over and held one cool hand up to Sarah's forehead. You're a little warm. Perhaps some Tylenol would help. She bustled away to the bathroom and returned, pills in hand, frowning slightly. Perhaps I should stay here. Sarah laughed, ignoring her symptoms, pushing past the haziness she felt. Don't be silly, Gina. I'm a grown woman and can take care of myself. I'll be fine. Don't you worry about a thing. The doorbell buzzed at that moment, which was perfect timing to keep Gina on track. Sarah bent down and lifted one of the smaller suitcases, her muscles aching as she did, and walked to the door to meet the cabbie. As he loaded the suitcases in the trunk, Sarah hugged Gina. Go see your family, Gina. Cook for them. Hug them close. Call me when you land. You'll be okay? Call me if you need me to come back and I'll make it happen. The older woman snapped her fingers, lickety-split. Sarah nodded and hugged her friend again. The last thing she would do would be to ask Gina to come back. Sometimes her friend could lose herself helping others. Most of Gina's family was the same way. They were brassy, affectionate, and loud. Sarah had met Gina's sisters and brothers, of which there were 6 in total, on several occasions, and knew that Gina's presence in their midst would help. By the time Sarah had woken up in the morning, Gina had received a text telling her that 2 of her nephews were among the missing. According to Gina's brother-in-law, Gina's sister, just 2 years younger than Gina, was in hysterics, not knowing where her 2 sons were. Sarah couldn't help but smile as she saw her friend out the door. Gina was a true friend, but Sarah was relieved to see her off. Her friend needed her family just as much as they needed her, especially in this time of crisis. She waved goodbye until the taxi rounded the bend before shutting the door on the pre-dawn darkness. She hadn't slept well, not at all, and her throat was sore, her eyes ached, and Sarah wondered again if she might be coming down with something. A little more rest, and I'm sure I'll be fine. The large, comfortable bed swallowed her up, and she pulled the covers over her, slipping into a deep sleep in seconds, despite her mind's best efforts to dwell on yesterday's interview with Sybil and the massive seizure that followed, or the terrible scenes from the train bombing. When her eyes slowly opened hours later, it felt as if she hadn't rested at all. The sun shone bright, and she struggled to focus on the clock on the bedside table. She groaned when the numbers slowly resolved to a more readable blur. It was after 10 in the morning, and she felt worse than she had when she first laid down. Her phone blinked with messages. How did I miss it ringing? It had been less than 2 feet away from my head on the nightstand. Blearily, she placed her glasses on her nose and peered at the screen. 2 missed calls from Dr. Carlson and 2 texts from Gina. She read the texts first, one from her friend saying she was at the airport and the plane was late, another as the plane taxied down the runway ready for takeoff. Her head thumped in pain as Sarah tried to estimate how long the flight would take her. Still in the air, I imagine. Her voice sounded rough, congested. She closed her Messages app and stared at the phone. There was a voicemail. She pressed the speaker button and played the message.
Sarah. Mrs. Aronson.
She smiled, hearing Dr. Carlson's voice as he stumbled over her name.
John Carlson here. I wanted to let you know that Sybil has, gone missing overnight. We are making all efforts to locate her, but we are unsure of her location at this time. Please feel free to call me if you have questions. I wanted to pass along to you some other information as well. Perhaps you could join me for lunch?
His voice wavered again.
I mean, if you wanted to, that is. Well, anyway, call me when you get this.
Gone missing? From a locked unit? How is that even possible? She pressed the button and listened to the phone ring once, twice, before John Carlson's voice answered.
Dr. Carlson speaking.
Dr. Carlson, it's Sarah Aronson.
Sarah, Mrs. Aronson, so good to hear from you. I trust you received my voicemail.
I did, and I'm free for lunch if the offer is still open. She pushed past the exhaustion and body aches, curious to learn what other information he had. It was worth pushing her body a little, just to learn how a woman as frail as Sybil had managed to escape a locked psychiatric unit. Flu be damned, she wanted to know more. Dr. Carlson's voice had an ebullient tone to it as he gave her directions on how to avoid a majority of the traffic and meet him at a local taqueria that he promised had the best burritos in all of L.A. "Great. I'll see you in 2 hours," she said, doing her best to sound spunky. As soon as the call disconnected, Sarah's hand fell to her side, heavy, aching. Her entire body felt as if she had just run a marathon, instead of sleeping past 10 in the morning. She couldn't remember the last time that had happened. 2 cups of the strongest coffee she could manage, along with a hot shower, relieved some of her malaise, enough for her to convince herself she was fine. Following the doctor's directions, she made decent time, and it was 1/2 the hour when she arrived. The small, nondescript restaurant was packed. Dr. Carlson had waited outside for her, his face lighting up when he saw her. He waved, and as she approached, the tense lines in his face smoothed, and he reached for the door.
"Believe it or not, we have a table waiting."
Sarah raised her eyebrows. The restaurant didn't seem the type to have reservations, and it was standing room only when they entered. He waved at the hostess and walked to a small table in one corner. He pulled out a chair for her, waited until she was seated, and then sat down. "Okay, I really need to know the story behind this," she said, laughing, after the hostess brought her a menu and gave Dr. Carlson a kiss on the cheek. He looked embarrassed.
"I wish they wouldn't do it, but I know better than to argue. Once I came in and didn't say anything, and Ramon, he's in the kitchen, chewed out their new hostess for not seating me immediately ahead of the others."
"Go on."
"I was in the emergency room with Landon. He had twisted his ankle falling out of a tree, and it wasn't supporting his weight, so he was having it x-rayed. And I saw the signs of a myocardial infarction in Ramon's grandmother, who was also there in the waiting room. He's a widower with 5 young children, and Abuela Vasquez." He stopped and looked sheepish. "Yes, that's what I call her. Anyway, she was there with Jacinta, who had a high fever." He shrugged. "She was so concerned with little Jacinta that she was ignoring her own health. I called a nurse over. Abuela was obviously in distress, and they admitted her immediately. She underwent a quadruple bypass the next day."
"Oh my goodness," Sarah gasped, her hand over her mouth.
In any case, the family was very grateful. I was visiting her a couple of days later, and Ramon came up to me and introduced himself, and he told me to come to the restaurant. I didn't, not for months, but finally I went by, and the second he saw me, he ran out of the kitchen and gave me a huge hug. He smiled. "I was invited to Lola's quinceañera last month. She's the oldest, and my kids get along with the others so well, it just feels like family."
"That's beautiful, Dr. Carlson."
"Please, call me John."
Sarah nodded. "Only if you call me Sarah."
"Fair enough."
He looked as if he wanted to say more, but a pretty young girl arrived at that moment. "Tito John, you brought a friend." She was small and looked far too young to be working in a restaurant during what had to be a school day.
Ben's eyes lit up. "Teresa, it must be spring break for me to see you here. How are you?"
He gave her a gentle hug. She grinned. "I'm good. Papa says he will come by later. It's very busy right now. But could Amelia come to my birthday party?"
"Of course. This weekend?"
"Yes." Sarah felt a surge of heat, not unlike a hot flash, and then a wave of exhaustion crashed over her. She was definitely ill. Why in the world did I think going out for lunch was a good idea? She stared at the menu while they chatted, and when there was a pause, she glanced up and found them staring at her expectantly. "Oh dear, what did I miss?" she asked, slightly flustered. John frowned, a look of concern on his face.
"Are you feeling okay? You look exhausted."
"I'm just tired." She forced a bright smile on her face and turned to Teresa. "I understand that your father makes the best burritos around. What do you suggest I try?" The girl smiled, her brown eyes lighting up with pride as she said, "My favorite is the chorizo, but it has a bit of heat." "That sounds fabulous," Sarah smiled. "I don't mind a bit of heat." She handed the menu back to Teresa.
"And I'll have the usual,"
John said, smiling at the girl. She nodded and slipped away to the kitchen. "What is the usual?" Sarah asked, her interest piqued.
"It changes," John answered, shrugging. "The first time I came here I said, 'Surprise me,' and they do, every time. Everything is amazing, by the way, truly the best in the valley."
He cocked his head and stared at her.
Are you sure you're okay?
Sarah waved her hand, distracted. I'm mostly just tired. My friend Gina, her 2 nephews are missing in the train bombing, and she flew out on a red-eye this morning. Between watching the news late and Gina leaving early, it's been hard. And I might be coming down with something. I'm not sure. God, I hope not. I don't want to get you ill.
Don't worry about me. I've got the constitution of a goat. I'm never ill, John assured her.
Sarah sipped her water and nibbled at the chips and salsa. Enough about me, though. I'm dying to hear how Sybil has gone missing. When did it happen? Was there anything on the security video? She had noticed the cameras throughout the hospital, their dark, round, black eyes, in most of the hallways, as well as the room she had interviewed Sybil in. John sighed, setting his water down and fiddling with his napkin.
Let me start with what happened after the seizure.
Sarah settled back. Yes, please do. I had never seen a grand mal seizure that was as violent as that. Carlson shook his head.
Nor have I. To tell you the truth, I was shocked at the severity of it, and typically the stronger the seizure, the longer it takes to recover from. But less than an hour later, she was screaming. I could hear her down the hall.
He rubbed his forehead, his hair thin. Sarah could see where his hairline had originally begun.
In any case, she was lucid enough to tell me about a Highway 49, and a sign for a town, one called Belden, or possibly Belton. I have my secretary looking into it. She believes that is where her baby is at.
Sarah's mouth flew open in surprise. I know exactly where that is. John cocked his head.
What?
Highway 49 runs through Belton, Missouri, just south of my hometown of Kansas City.
Seriously?
Yes. My son and his family live in Belton. I'm quite familiar with the area. She pulled out her phone and typed a quick message to Michael, groaning with frustration as it refused to send. Another service failure. These are getting more and more frequent, and not just with Connect Now. John had his phone out, shaking his head over the connection icon.
Same here. Between the outages and the rolling blackouts, it sometimes feels like we're heading back to the Dark Ages.
Hey now, Sarah managed to smile at him. I grew up in the Dark Ages. He had the good grace to blush and began to stutter an apology when Teresa returned, balancing 2 plates, each loaded with a burrito, pico sauce, and more. They smelled amazing. Despite feeling an ever-increasing sensation of weariness, Sarah's stomach growled in anticipation. She was thankful for the full restaurant and its ambient noise. Papa said you will like this one, Tito. It is a mix of barbacoa and carnitas with extra hot sauce. John grinned at the girl.
Thank you, Teresa, and thanks to your papa. I have been looking forward to this all week.
Sarah's burrito was deliciously spicy, but she could only manage a few bites before her body, now thoroughly convinced it needed to be in bed, rebelled. She set it down and drank some water instead. It would be truly amazing if Sybil's baby is found in Missouri. I must admit, the thought of a baby out there somewhere, missing, and perhaps injured or worse, it keeps cycling around in my head. I can only hope we manage to get a happy ending to this.
Indeed,
Carlson said, wiping a bit of sauce from his mouth. Sarah leaned forward, in part so she could rest her body on her 2 elbows and hopefully hide her malaise a little longer. I'm dying to know how Sybil escaped from a locked ward, however.
John shook his head. We are still trying to figure that out. Truly, I'm stumped. I'll tell you what I know, but this is off the record. Insurance and public relations are both an issue, you understand.
Of course, I completely understand. He took another large bite of the burrito, finished chewing and swallowing, and sighed in contentment.
I wasn't kidding. I look forward to my lunch here every week. If I ate here every day, I'd end up too wide to fit in the door.
He frowned slightly at Sarah's burrito.
Was yours too spicy?
What? Oh, God, no. I just can't manage to stuff myself with any more of it right now. She waved her hand. Too much coffee, perhaps.
You might be catching that virus that is going around. We're operating on a skeleton crew today. 2 more of my staff called in sick.
I really hope I'm not, but I'll be honest. I feel worse than I did before I left. I'm so sorry. The last thing you need is to get some nasty virus. She leaned back in her chair, hyper-aware now, feeling warmer than she had earlier.
Like I said, I am rarely ill. No worries, seriously.
He wiped his fingers.
Back to Sybil, however.
Yes, please.
All we know at this point is that she was in her locked room last evening, that the orderlies logged her as present up until 5 a.m., when there was a shift change. The incoming staff performed a routine check of the corridor and found Sybil's door unlocked and open, and her bed empty.
Well, surely the security cameras show something. Perhaps the orderlies skipped a walkthrough or two. It's been known to happen, Sarah asked, frowning, as Dr. Carlson shook his head.
That's the weird part. The cameras show nothing. Not only that, but there was no lapse or lost time. I went through them myself. No one can explain it. It's as if she vanished from her room.
Through a window? He laughed.
Through the bars? 6 stories off of the ground?
Sarah flushed in embarrassment. Oh. She looked up at the doctor, met his eyes. Then how?
Believe me, I'm flummoxed. I've got nothing.
What about external cameras? He frowned.
I haven't checked them.
Well, perhaps you should. Sarah shrugged. I am as befuddled as you, but I'd double-check the exterior cameras, just to be sure.
That's not a bad idea. I'll do that when I return to work.
He caught the eye of the waitress and asked for 2 takeout boxes and dug into his wallet.
Now is when I get to be sneaky. You ready for it?
He pulled 2 $20 bills out. Sarah looked around. Sneaky? Why?
They won't accept payment, no matter how often I return, so I have to get inventive. Help me out?
What do you need me to do?
I'll distract her. You slip the money into her apron pocket.
He grinned at her, and Sarah was struck by his open, kind smile. It reminded her of Theo, despite Dr. Carlson being at least 20 years younger. Theo had brought out the best in her and everyone around him. She missed having that in her day-to-day life. Sarah found herself smiling back and taking the money from his hand. When Teresa returned with the takeout boxes, John distracted her by asking for her help and winked at Sarah as she managed to slip the bills into the girl's pocket.
You make a fine co-conspirator, Sarah. Thank you for that.
John took her arm gently and guided her out of the restaurant after Teresa moved on to the next table. That was the highlight of my day. Intrigue, conspiracy, and... oh... Sarah's body finally rebelled, and she stopped abruptly, dizziness and fatigue now fighting with nausea. She swayed, and John's grip on her tightened.
You aren't well at all,
John exclaimed. There was concern in his voice. I really thought I would be fine, but she swayed again, and she could feel sweat beading on her forehead, her cheeks flushing. I am so sorry, John.
Here. My car is right here. Let's sit you down until you can get your bearings.
He guided her to the passenger side and helped her slide into the seat. The car was warm from the sun, and Sarah was hit with a wave of dizziness. At that moment, all she wanted to do was curl up and sleep. She put her right hand on the dashboard and leaned forward, waiting for the world to stop spinning all around her. John's voice held concern.
I really think I should take you to the emergency room, or would you rather see your primary doctor?
I don't... oh, another wave of dizziness. Would you believe I don't have a doctor here in L.A.? It sounds so stupid now, but honestly, I've been so healthy that I haven't bothered finding one. I do my annual when I go to visit my son and his family in Missouri each summer, and, oh, I don't want to be sick in your car. She tried to stand up, but Carlson wasn't having it.
Sarah, I'm happy to take you to the ER. I'll get a bag in case you feel nauseous, but you have no business driving right now, especially not with some of the drivers I see loose on the road.
She knew he was right. Okay, but honestly, I just need to go home and rest.
Are you sure?
He handed her a thick, insulated bag.
I'm worried about you.
Really? I'll be fine. I'm sure it's just a nasty virus. A couple of days and I'll be right as rain. The ride back to Gina's beach house was subdued. John had assured her that her car would be safe there in the parking lot and had double-checked that it was locked. Sarah concentrated on not throwing up. Her stomach was spinning and she felt sweaty and feverish. When they arrived, John parked the car in the drive, got out, and opened Sarah's door. Everything was moving faster around her, while she sloshed through a thick mire, her brain fogged and her body miserable. Why did I ever think I was okay to leave the house this morning? She was dimly aware of the doctor's hands steadying her as they walked together to the front door. All she wanted was to be in bed. If she could just lay still, surely the nausea would pass. "I am so sorry," she mumbled. "I had no idea I would feel this ill." She kicked off her shoes and tried to smile up at John. 2 or 3 copies of his face swam in front of her.
"Please let me take you to the ER, Sarah."
There was such deep concern in his face, and despite him being younger than her, she was reminded again of Theo. She reached up, her hand hot against his cheek. "Really, I'll be fine. I just need to lie down and rest. You'll keep me updated if you hear anything? If they find the baby? Or if they locate Sybil?"
"Of course. May I check in on you later today and see how you are doing?"
She nodded, and he backed down the hall towards the door.
"And if you need anything at all, you will call me?"
"Yes, of course." She managed to smile. He was a kind man, and for the first time in years, she felt a spark of desire. More for the companionship than anything else, the steadfast presence of another person in your life. She felt Gina's absence and Theo's keenly at that moment. "Once I have a rest, I'll feel much better, I'm sure of it." She fought to stand steady on her feet until he left, the door closed and locked behind him, before she tottered to her bed and collapsed. Nightmares and bouts of semi-conscious wakefulness stole any real rest from her sleep for the next several hours. At some point of it, the nausea finally gave way to a panicked run to the toilet, where she managed to get most of the contents of her stomach into the bowl. Unlike most bouts of nausea, she felt worse after, not better. The room spun as she levered her way into a standing position and rinsed her face, hair, and shirt. She felt ridiculously guilty for not keeping the tasty burrito down, even though she knew it wasn't her fault. Also, it had burned worse coming up. As the afternoon sun sent the rays of light sliding around to the west, her room cooled, a relief from her fever at first, but she was soon shivering uncontrollably. Her phone buzzed intermittently. Gina would have landed by now, and Sarah's thoughts landed in a murky, half-conscious state that kept needling her to answer the phone. She couldn't, though. Her body was stripped of energy for any other activity than running to the bathroom and laying on her rumpled bed. She closed her eyes, ignoring the phone, the cold descending over her limbs, and lost herself to the darkness.
"Sarah! Sarah!"
A voice intruded on the dark oblivion. Theo's voice was calling to her. What was he doing here, anyway? She tried to open her eyes, but it seemed like too much effort. Maybe in a little while, once I've had more sleep. She sank back into the darkness, a part of her noting that the voice couldn't be Theo's, but sounded familiar. He was talking to someone else now, too.
"Right this way. She's in here."
"Sir, if you could please give us some room," an unfamiliar voice. A cool hand on her wrist, hands gently rolling her onto her back. She was too tired to respond. As she cracked an eye open, a blinding light caused her to flinch.
"Are you her husband, sir?" No, I'm a friend."
He sounded distraught.
"I should have taken her to the emergency room earlier, but she said she just wanted to go home."
"Don't beat yourself up. We have been seeing this a lot in the past week. The virus hits fast and hard, especially in the very young and the elderly." Gentle hands, a gloved finger opening one eye. She flinched again, and then, without her normal 10-second warning, found herself retching up a dark green bile. It dribbled down the side of the bed and onto the white carpet.
"Okay, Mrs. Aronson, okay. I think it's time for a quick ride to the hospital."
The man turned away, speaking to his partner.
"Let's get an IV hooked up with a saline drip. She's dehydrated, and her temp is at 104.2. Also, call ahead and let them know we have one for potential admit to the ICU."
Sarah heard Theo. No, not Theo. It was John Carlson, pacing at the far end of the room.
"I should have taken her straight to the ER,
he muttered. A young woman's voice then. You couldn't have known, Uncle John. And besides, you got help for her. Come on, we can drive ahead to the hospital. She felt hands lift her, then she was settled onto a hard surface before Sarah slipped back into the abyss. Hours later, as the sun's rays turned the skyline from a midnight blue to a rosy pink, John pulled out his phone and dialed home. It rang twice before Amelia answered, her voice husky with sleep. Still at the hospital, Uncle Jay? He looked out the window. To the east, he could see the sky lighting up with salmon and pink, contrasting sharply against the low foothills in the distance. His chest felt heavy, constricted.
I am. I just wanted to check in and see if Mrs. Almeida could take you to practice. I'll be home by noon, and I don't want you to be late with the championship coming up.
Okay. I'll ask her in a bit, after I take a shower.
Are the boys okay?
They're still sound asleep. They watched some horror flick, and Landon curled up in my bed. She sounded annoyed. John smiled briefly. Amelia was the oldest, and at 14 was full of the typical teenage angst. Is your friend any better? John's smile dropped away.
No.
Amelia's tone changed. Oh, I'm sorry, Uncle Jay.
Yeah, I have to finish making calls now.
Okay, I'll make sure and make breakfast for everyone. She paused. And Uncle Jay?
Yes.
It was really good of you to stay with her, you know. She wasn't alone.
John nodded, even though his niece couldn't see it. I'll see you after practice, Sam.
The bed they had placed her in was empty. Sarah's body had already been transported down to the morgue. The sheets had been stripped, and the room cleaned with speed. There were more ill patients being brought in. He had been downstairs. The ER and the halls near the admissions desk were clogged with scores more who had arrived sick with the flu. He had sat there next to her bed, against the rules, and held her hand and talked to her. He told her that the baby had been found. The story seemed impossible. The infant had been strapped into a baby seat, still spinning, in the middle of the road when a couple had very nearly hit her. She was in care now, with the very people who had discovered her.
The craziest part of it, Sarah,
he had said, her hand limp in his.
The baby was found on the same day that Sybil was taken into custody.
There had been no response. She hadn't stirred, not once, never gaining consciousness, never learning the news that had compelled him to first call and then come to her door the night before. He had been too late to save her, and he felt wretched at the thought of her passing from the world without anyone but him by her side. They had been practically strangers. Despite this, he had felt a connection with her, one that ached with loss, grief, as he imagined what could have been if they had just had more time. He glanced down at his watch, noted the time, and headed for the door. Her son's plane would be touching down soon. He had found Michael's name in the contact info on Sarah's phone and called him near midnight as her breathing became uneven and the doctor had shaken his head, the look on his face betraying the truth. Michael had been first suspicious, who wouldn't, with a call from a stranger in the middle of the night. But once John had explained the connection and the dire situation, Sarah's son had made reservations on a red-eye and headed for the airport, calling John from the runway before departure to give him the flight information. It would be close to 2 hours before he landed, just enough time in rush hour to make it to the airport. John parked his car, and as he oriented himself to the correct terminal, Sarah's phone buzzed in his pocket. He thought of letting it ring. Who was he to answer a dead woman's phone? He saw the number was local, however, and pressed the green button. The woman on the other end was already talking.
Sarah, honey, I've been trying to reach you since I landed yesterday. Where have you been? Oh, girl, you were so right, aren't you? Always.
This had to be Gina, Sarah's roommate. Sarah had described Gina as someone who could talk a mile a minute without taking a breath.
Coming here was the best thing I could have done. My sister was losing her ever-loving mind, and everyone was coming over and just standing around. I mean, really, just working themselves up something fierce while we waited for word, and so I fixed that cannoli like you suggested, and Carmelina and Lucina went from crying and screaming to calm and nothing flat, and the best news, Sarah, honey, they found both the boys. I mean, they're not boys any longer. Maria's pushing 40, and Sylvia's not far behind, but they're both okay. beat to hell. Mario's got a broken leg, ribs, and missing a pinky, for the love of God. But Sylvia walked out with scratches. He was helping get others out, and both of them lost their phones in the confusion. By the time the cannoli were out of the oven, we got word he was alive and fine, though I'm pretty sure Carmelina is going to kill him for not calling home, and I'm running on fumes. The pullout in the front room is lumpier than my auntie's mashed potatoes.
I'm so sorry, but...
John interjected. Gina gasped. Who is this? What have you done with Sarah?
My name is John Carlson. I'm the department psychiatrist at Cedars-Sinai. Sarah fell ill with a bad strain of the flu, Gina.
There was silence from Gina's end, just a whoosh of air, then a door closed, and Gina didn't say anything for a long moment. When she did, her ebullient tone was gone.
Is Sarah all right?
I'm sorry. She's not. We met for lunch yesterday. She was obviously ill, but insisted she would be fine. Later in the evening, she wasn't answering her phone. I came by and found her very ill. I called for an ambulance. They admitted her to the hospital, but unfortunately, she worsened. I am so sorry to tell you this, but she passed away early this morning.
Oh, God, Gina began to sob. Oh, I should have been there for her. That woman, that patient of yours, she told Sarah she would die. I never should have left. Never. She was right. About the bombing, about Sarah dying, everything.
As he stood there, he could see the plane taxi up, nestling against the gate. He watched as the first passengers appeared from the long hallway. John's fingers felt numb. He hadn't thought of it until now, what Sybil had said in the observation room. How could he have forgotten it? He'd written it off, certain of her mental instability, that he'd barely given the words credence, save for any mentions of her child. How had she known? Gina was still talking.
Sybil was right. She was right about the bombing. She was right about the flu. What else is she right about?
A group of 3 women appeared first. Behind them, a short, older man, a sour expression on his face.
I'm so sorry, Gina. I wish I knew what to say,
John told her.
I have to go. Her son flew in and his plane just landed.
Whatever she said next, he missed it, his eyes fixed on a taller man who had appeared, a backpack in one hand. He looked anxious as his eyes searched the crowd waiting for the passengers to disembark. John could see a strong resemblance to Sarah in him.
Michael?
He stepped forward, and the younger man zeroed his attention on John.
Dr. Carlson?
He asked, his brilliant blue eyes laser-focused.
How is my mother?
John shook his head.
I cannot tell you how sorry I am, Michael. Sarah passed away 2 hours ago.
The younger man shook his head, his mouth opened and closed in shock and grief. Hours later, John returned to his house. It was empty. Amelia was at practice, and the boys had left a note that they were at a friend's house and would be back after they ate dinner. John peeled off the clothes he had worn for more than 24 hours and stepped into the shower. The baby had been found, even if her mother was now missing, and the world had lost a talented, kind woman. John Carlson closed his eyes as the water ran in rivulets, washing his body clean, the steam billowing over the top of the shower doors. A storm was coming. He could feel it building.